G'day and welcome to our spring break series of The Other Side interviews and The Other Side Australia. I'm Damien Curry. Tonight we're going to hear from a man who believes the entire Australian housing market is a Ponzi scheme that must eventually unravel. This week is week 2 of our spring break. We'll be back to normal shows next Tuesday. We're playing you the best of the first 10 weeks of our 2 shows this Friday night here on ADH TV at 8 p.m. We'll be streaming the second of our 2 spring break best of episodes of The Other Side Australia, recapping the best bits from the early episodes of our weekend weekly news and commentary show. And tonight on The Other Side Interviews, our Tuesday night long form interview show, we'll be bringing another of our best early interviews. Tonight we're replaying our most watched show ever, our June interview on episode 209i of The Other Side Interviews, our interview with Matt Barrie, the CEO and founder of freelancer.com, an online freelancing and crowdsourcing marketplace. Matt says Australia is in for a much rockier time ahead than most of us realise. He holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford University in the United States. In 2011, he was named the inaugural BRW Entrepreneur of the Year. And in 2014, Smart Company magazine named him the most influential person in technology in Australia. Here's my interview with Matt Barrie back in June. A couple of weeks ago, Matt gave a speech at the Sydney Morning Herald's Sydney 2050 Summit entitled The Great Australian Scream. Matt joins me now from his Sydney office, and I might point out, Matt, that backdrop is not a video screen. You are literally in front of a live window there. Great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Damien.
Why the Great Australian Scream?
Well, I think every Australian would realise that when you go to the pub and your schooner of beer now costs $12, $13, $14, sometimes $15, your landlord's jacking up your rent by 10 or 15%. The banks are jacking up your mortgage 100, 200, 300%, your energy bill's up 20, 25%, that something is terribly wrong in this country. And I think that successive generations, successive governments, this is not one government, this is many governments, have taken the path of easy, relentless growth in this country. And the path of easily, relentless growth they've chosen to take is pray that, commodity prices go up. We are a very primitive country in terms of what we export. We dig out of the ground basically dirt, which is iron ore, stick it on a boat and ship it to China. We dig out dead trees, which is basically coal, and ship it overseas to Japan and China. And lately, gold prices have been up, so you've been doing okay with gold, and gas prices have been up. We've been doing okay with gas. And while hoping that they continue to rise, and they have been rising for a while, although iron ore and coal and gas have come off the boil lately, in between that, let's just keep pushing house prices up, right? So house prices have gone up over the last 60 years, 86 times. And government policy, absent of hoping and praying that commodity prices go up, commodities that we don't elaborately transform into higher end goods, such as petrochemicals and so forth, have led to a situation where the country where it has manufacturing as a percentage of GDP on par with a financial haven like Luxembourg, right? It's on par with Botswana, where you can go see cheetahs. So in the meantime, they've just been pumping house prices, and they pump house prices quite simply. House prices don't go up because wages are going up. Wages haven't been going up for a very long time. In fact, many years ago, Matthias Cormann said that suppressing wages was really by design, an economic architecture. And it's not because we're having more babies. In fact, the Australian population, every woman on the planet needs to have 2.1 children to maintain the population. I think we're currently about 1.6 in Australia, and we haven't been above 2.1 since 1975. The only reason why house prices are going up is because we're bringing more people into the country. In fact, last year, 400,000 people, equivalent to the population of Canberra, right? Now, the problem is we can't build enough houses to house these people, right? The federal government's just recently announced they're going to build 1 million homes by 2029. On the current rate of bringing people in, there'll be 1 million homes for 3 million people, right?
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Let's go back to, if I could just interrupt, go back to what you were saying initially. It's a lot to digest, but just taking it one step at a time, you've got this situation where we are completely dependent on, significantly dependent upon coal and gas exports, yet we are turning off the tap on both gradually, which will leave us with iron ore, which I think our major customer, China, is finding other sources. There's more supply. That's driving iron ore prices down. If iron ore prices go down and we stop trading in gas and coal because we want to be all net zero, what does that leave Australia with but to flog off its space to a bigger immigration policy?
Well, it leads us to our fifth biggest export, which is called education-related travel services, which is a euphemism for immigration dressed up as education, which is a $30 billion a year industry where we have 620,000 students in the country, and everybody knows they're not students. They're a low-cost workforce that's being brought in, and they're being brought in to prop up GDP, not GDP per capita, but GDP, and work in the 7-Eleven or drive an Uber, right? And in fact, it's pretty amazing. I saw yesterday in the newspaper that of the 9 universities in New South Wales, 8 of them are losing money, despite record numbers of students in the country. The universities aren't making any money. And so you go, this is a bit strange. What's actually happening? You know, are these actually really students, or are they going through the vocational education system and the other RTOs and so forth?
Right.
And there's something else going on, right? And really, I think it's late stage desperation in a Ponzi scheme. I mean, the housing market going up, you know, for 60 years effectively, relentlessly, has led to a Ponzi of all proportions. I mean, it's a housing bubble of all bubbles. In the global financial crisis, you had bubbles in the housing market in the United States, you had bubbles in the UK, you had bubbles in Ireland, Portugal, and so forth. And what we did in 2008 is we doubled down. And already in 2008, Australian households were twice as indebted to the housing market than the Americans were. So Australia now, household debt's about 211%, which is double to GDP, which is double the US, a country that you normally associate with credit cards and debt. Households are basically at a breaking point, and mortgages are skyrocketing. We're currently at 3.85% in terms of the interest rate, which is lagging the US, the UK, and Canada, which are 4.5 to 5 and a bit. And we're at the point now where it's a complete replay of the movie The Big Short. The Big Short, which was the great financial crisis, we had Steve Carell. You had this iconic scene where he went to a strip club and he had a stripper dancing, saying she had 5 houses and a condo, and she was on what's called adjustable rate mortgages, right? These adjustable rate mortgages were written at about 2% interest rate, but after 2 to 3 years exploded about 200, 300% higher. And that's exactly what's happening right now in Australia, is that all these mortgages during COVID were written about 1.95%. And this quarter, 17% of all fixed rate mortgages will come off those low rates and go up to a much, much higher rate. And by the latest data I saw, the mortgages are now 7-8%, and if rates go up next week, it'll be 9%. And it's exactly the global financial crisis, which we saw in America, happening here in Australia today. And we've reached the logical conclusion of everything. Australian banks have $1.5 trillion of the mortgages. And
we're not operating in a smart way, Matt, but we keep pushing the pain down the road, don't we? We never really feel the pain. With COVID even, we just borrowed our way out of the pain. Now we have this massive government debt that we haven't had before. You add to that, as you said, the household debt. I mean, if government debt, state and federal, is running at about $1.5 trillion, I think, what is the household private debt on top of that?
It's 211% of GDP. Actually, it's probably significantly higher right now. I mean, if you think about the household, right? In Australia, 62% of renters in Australia are in rental stress. And that means that in a given month, their outflows are greater than their inflows. 48% of mortgages in Australia are in mortgage stress. In New South Wales, 70% of renters are in rental stress, right? And the remarkable thing is, of all the immigrants we're bringing in, right, and we're basically getting them in to trick them to work in a cafe for the most part, because Australians can't afford, despite the highest casual wages in the world, Australians can't afford to work in many jobs that have casual staff. We bring people in to work in those cafes for a bit, tricking them, thinking that there's a great lifestyle here, before they realise they can't afford it either, right? And we've created a crisis of all proportions where we've got rampant inflation, we've got and the root of all evil in Australia is really housing and land costs. Housing and land costs mean that businesses get crimped because, believe it or not, Sydney restaurants and Melbourne restaurants pay more per square metre to rent than Manhattan, and more than LA.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Right? So when a business is paying astronomical land costs, they're paying the highest casual wages in the world, yet on those casual wages, people can't live, right? What we've decided to do is bring in a whole bunch of students, in inverted commas, to try and make it work. And that's gone on for way too long. And we've reached the logical conclusion of a Ponzi scheme. At some point, you've got to find more and more chumps to trick to come in and to buy a house. And Sydney house prices are at astronomical levels. I mean, socio-economists say that if the median household price to the median household income is 3 times or less, housing is affordable. If it's 3 to 4 times, it's unaffordable. If it's 4 to 5 times, it's severely unaffordable, and 5 and above is extremely unaffordable.
Trouble. Yeah.
Sydney
Where are we at?
13.3.
Sorry?
13.3.
What was that number?
Sydney's
13.3. Oh my God.
It's the second most expensive housing market in the world outside of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a tiny little island with limited space outside the most populous nation in the world. So we're at 13 point. There's no reason why Sydney, in the middle of nowhere, it's a beautiful place to live. It's beautiful. You can see the harbour behind me. It's beautiful. Great people, great lifestyle, great food in a way. But there's no reason why Sydney should be 13.3. New York and London are 7. So at this point, house prices have gone way too far because every government doesn't know what to do and they kick the can down the road. House prices need to halve or wages need to double, right? Businesses can't afford to double wages unless they sack a lot of people. And so house prices have to halve. And the only way we can get house prices to halve, we can't increase supply because we've been trying desperately for 2 decades to build houses. Even before that, in the lead up to for example, the Sydney 2000 Olympics, we had a massive home building exercise in Australia. That's been continuing since 2000. We've got, it's remarkable. There's like 868 cranes in Australia building houses, 365 of them in in Sydney, and there's 10 in New York and 14 in Chicago. So we've been on this ridiculous householding building binge. We're the 4th highest nation in the OECD in terms of rate of building house supply, which, unlike what Philip Lowe said, I think last night or the day before, where he said, we're not building enough houses. We've been going flat chat. We're not being able to increase the number of tradies in the country, despite record immigration. And the tradies, for example, in New South Wales, where I live, they've been capped around 300,000 because every time costs go up and prices go up and so forth, they flee to Queensland or somewhere or the country or somewhere cheaper they can afford to live, right? Yeah. So we've created an unbearable situation where the easy, relentless growth is basically push house prices, and we're at the logical limit of what households can afford.
Yeah. So, the housing crisis is often spoken of in terms of supply problem. It's a supply problem. We need to be building more properties. You're saying we can't? We're doing too much?
There was 1,700 insolvencies in construction in the last 12 months. All these apartment builders are going bust because they've gone into fixed price contracts to build these apartments, and inflation has driven up the raw material prices, and inflation is driving up wages, right? So they actually can't afford to build the
projects. Can't go ahead.
Record insolvencies. The tradies are leaving. In a decade, we haven't managed to budge the tradie number, and now we've got the Brisbane Olympics coming up, and so every tradie and their dog is going up to Brisbane to get better pay rates to build out the stadiums and so forth for the Olympics that are coming up. So we can't increase supply. So therefore, the only thing we can do is reduce demand. And Albanese has gone full Burko on immigration the other way around, turning every single tap he can on in a desperate attempt to prop everything up. So, removing lifting the cap on permanent migrants, removing the skilled list, letting in the New Zealanders. God knows we'll let the Tasmanians in soon next. That's a joke. But, basically allowing anyone who's here, I think it's 2.1 at the moment, the temporary skilled visa in the country, a path to permanent residency, and so on. Every possible tap you can turn on, he's turned on in a full Ponzi move, desperately attempting to keep the housing market by therefore the banks solvent, because we're going to head into a GFC style event. Every housing market around the world has had a bubble, pretty much, in the Western world, and deflated eventually. And we have doubled down, and we're actually at the limit now of what households can afford. Everyone knows it. Everyone walking around, you go to the pub, and there's a steak for sale for $56, and it might be a nice steak, but Jesus Christ, wasn't? How did that happen? I remember beers are $1, $2, right? 20, 30 years ago. Why now $15, right?
Yeah.
So we're at the limit.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've sounded the alarm on this for some time. I remember a piece you wrote in 2017 called House of Cards that went completely viral on many platforms, this article. And it really spoke to the lack of breadth of our economic diversity in Australia, that we have a very, very narrow economy built on mining and everything else is stacked narrowly on top of that. And yet here we are saying, let's turn off gas and coal, which could possibly cause that house of cards to collapse. What is your take on, why other people are not sounding this alarm as much as you are? Some critics of yours have said that, you're too alarmist. Your thesis sounds pretty right to me. What's your take on why you are one of the few voices crying out there?
Well, I mean, there's a few reasons. First of all, just to talk a little about the economy, just briefly as a preface. In terms of economic complexity, you're dead on correct. Outside of iron ore, coal, gas, and gold, and followed by that, immigration, justice, education, we do very little in this country, unfortunately. We used to do things like make cars. In 1995, we were a car manufacturer. We had Holden, right? We've let manufacturing this country waste away, and it's on par with a financial haven, as I said before, like Luxembourg or a nation like Botswana. We can go and see cheetahs, right? We ranked 91st in the world, 91st as a country at about 190 in the world for economic complexity by Harvard.
So the economic complexity index is a measure of how complex your economy is, how diverse it is, how many different branches you've got to the economy that you can rely on. If one branch collapses, you've got the other one to pick it up. We are way down. I think we're below Ghana, aren't we?
We're behind Guatemala, Laos, and Kenya, right?
Okay.
It's
we're doing great.
We are, right? And so successive governments have thought, okay, well, how do we deal with this? We'll deal with it on two fronts. We'll deal with it on immigration. So we'll let a lot of people into the country, and immigration has its place, and it is very useful. But you've got to balance out an immigration system with skills that are needed and the local populace, right? And really, what really has been managed is house prices. As long as house prices go up, generally speaking, the government thought everything was okay. But they've gone up so far and so extreme and so off kilter with the rest of the world that we're at the point now where it just affects everything. It affects businesses. It affects your everyday life and why you can't afford to get a meal. It affects energy prices. It affects everything, right? And it's so expensive as a result to do things like manufacture here, right? And so we don't do very much here. We do very little here. It's about 5.5% is manufacturing as a percentage of gross value add. So we're at a point now. We've let it all fall away, and it's a bit like an old comment about being a banana republic, right? That banana republic comment that was made back in the 90s was around having just one export, and we don't really have one export. We've got 3 or 4 major exports, but those exports all go to one country. So effective in a way, we are a bit of a banana economy. I mean, everything that we do in terms of that we produce and dig out of the ground, and we don't turn into anything that's higher value or more complex, we ship to China, 34% of that, and in return, we take 2% of Chinese exports back. So we're completely beholden to China, right?
Yeah.
And we're at the point now where it's I think it's the end of the road. Simply kick the can as far as you can. And a lot of government intervention has come in. And while government intervention comes in, you can push things a long, long, long way. But we're at the point now where a household generates so much income in terms of wages. That's dictated by what businesses can afford. The businesses aren't doing particularly well unless maybe you've been a bank or you've been at a mine. And now we're at the point where you can't afford the rent, you can't afford the energy prices, you can't afford a nice meal, you can't afford to go out. And we're at that point where we're up to our gills in debt.
How do we broaden the economic base then, Matt? How do we make our economy more complex? How do we bring back manufacturing when, you've got countries around the world that are not paying decent wages, they are competing against us in an unfair marketplace, we can't afford to manufacture here, and when we do manufacture, it's too expensive. It's cheaper to import. It's hard to get any bucks for our exports.
There's a few things we can do. One is we do need to bring down land prices as a percentage of everything else, right? I mean, they're just astronomically high, so that leads to high wages in order to be able to pay the rent and this, that, the other. So we've got to bring that ratio down. There's a range of things we can do, right? There's a range of measures in terms of, if people are turning up to universities and then, going to work at a 7-Eleven and not actually going to uni. And apparently the scam everyone tells me on Twitter is you come into a university in Australia, then 6 months later you get your overseas visa, you go work, you then drop out to an RTO or a vet sort of education system, which is designed really to get you a visa and nothing else, and then you go off and work. Right, we can crack down on that. We can crack down on the sheer rate and so forth. But then the flip side of what else we can do is we can raise the skills. We have for a very long period of time we've neglected the skills of our domestic citizens. Right, the universities went crazy trying to attract foreign students, and I know because I was an adjunct professor for 14 years at the University of Sydney. You had ridiculous situations where the domestic students were prejudiced for the international students because they'll turn up at 9 a.m. for a maths class, then have to hang around till 4 p.m., 5 p.m. for some of the advanced courses because we had to cater to international students who had to work during the day, right? So we can build those skills. We can do things with advanced manufacturing techniques. We can do things with robotics. We do a fair bit of scientific research in this country, but we need to get more people into technology and science, and particularly manufacturing. I think we had a big opportunity during COVID to, instead of pay people for sitting on the bums at home, to actually put them into online education, whether it's at the TAFEs in the blue collar jobs and the machining jobs and so forth, through to degrees. I think there's a lot we can do about getting domestic students educated rather than just completely try and bring in economic migrants who are pretending to be international students. So we build the skills up. We really try and concentrate in areas where we've got a lot of raw materials that can be elaborately transformed into higher end goods. And we should do that. I know there's some stuff happening with green hydrogen and so forth, but if you go speak to, I've got one of my friends is one of the senior scientists at Woodside Petroleum. They've got a lot of ideas about what we can do with the gas that we generate out of the ground. There's a lot of things we can do with Australian smarts. We just have to have a government that talks the right message, and we've got to reset some of the relative prices of things.
We seem to want to have it all, though, don't we? We want to have the net zero, but we are reliant upon coal and gas. We don't want to do nuclear because we're worried about the effects of nuclear, yet there seems to be a whole industry there just begging for Australia to sort of seize it. Are you getting the ear of politicians? Are people listening? I mean, what's your take on the current state of our political class?
Well, no, I absolutely agree with you on nuclear. We absolutely should do nuclear, and it was probably a bit of a mistake to turn off the coal-fired power plants. We probably should build some more modern, efficient power plants. So I don't think we're ready for net zero, and I think Australia, in terms of the global impact, on emissions, if emissions are a major issue, and I don't think they're the emergency that everyone kind of raves on.
Well, the point is, I mean, we're not going to make any impact on net zero whatsoever. Nothing that Australia does is going to have a diddly squat impact
in the short term. And look, and I certainly believe in the longer term. I think pollution generally is bad, and we should make sure we've got a great environment. And by the way, bringing a lot of people is not great for the environment.
No.
But I think we're certainly not ready to do an instant transition, and I think we should definitely be building nuclear. And then one reason people don't really understand what's going on in the world is because journalism, with the advent of the internet and the Google sort of model for ads, has meant that journalism's been greatly reduced. The media companies have been, really now driven to produce 500-word articles that have clickbait headlines to drive the Google ad machine, and as a result, nobody can string a coherent narrative together. I mean, it's only segments like this where you sit down and do an in-depth interview with a level of intelligence discourse that people actually start to string together little 500-word articles that they kind of see here, there on websites to figure out what's going on.
Yep.
People know that something's wrong, but they can't actually figure it out because there's no in-depth analysis of this. The other flip side is that the two major dominant media companies in this country, which is News Limited and Fairfax, their growth machine, their cash cow, are the two major property classifieds. So REA is somewhere around 74% of News Corp's market cap, and Domain is somewhere around 34% of Fairfax's market cap. So it's not in their interest to talk about this. In fact, you're more likely to find a story on those websites about a train driver who was jobless with a $40 million property portfolio than you are about, hey, this is actually, here's an interesting person who's set up a manufacturing plant and this is what he's doing, and this, it's a great business. Let's go out there and do more of this. You're more likely to hear about a McDonald's worker with a $15 million worth of property who's hanging on for dear life. And let me tell you, with the global financial crisis in the US, exactly what happened there is exactly what's happening here. 1.95% mortgages going up to 8-9% plus, and God knows where it will end. The official inflation rate's 7%, right? The unofficial inflation rate, which anyone with half a clue with looking around them will go, it's got to be at least 10-15%, but based on the prices of just everything going up, their rent going up. The rent's not going up by 7, the rent's going up by 15, right?
Yeah.
So everyone
so these are the big costs. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is based on a basket of goods. That basket of goods is not necessarily reflective of what everybody is feeling, and that the real inflation rate, when you bring it down to things like rent, is a lot higher. You mentioned there the McDonald's worker who might have a $15 million property portfolio, but $16 million worth of debt on it, and the whole thing could just collapse. Explain for people who don't understand the economics the connection between interest rates and inflation.
Right. Well, if inflation is really high, so for example, the price of things are going up all the time, 10%, you come in, your beer's $11, and you come in next year at $12, and you come in now it's $14. To try and take that heat out of the economy, you've got to get people to save. You've got to get people to put money into their bank accounts, right? And to do that, typically what happens is the RBA issues a sort of a policy rate, which is the rate at which the banks can kind of lend can borrow from the RBA, and in return, the interest rate on things like your deposit account is supposed to go up so people save more, and the cost of your mortgage is supposed to go up so people borrow less, right? It's a kind of a bizarre situation at the moment. You go to the Commonwealth Bank has $639 billion worth of mortgages, residential mortgages. There's about $150 billion of business lending and about 17 billion of consumer finance. Their deposit account pays 0%. Zero. So why would you put your money in your standard everyday account at 0%? Why would you save anything at all, right? So even if as interest rates go up, mortgages get more expensive, people are less likely to borrow. And at the moment, I've been told from my friends that work in banking, the banks are really pulled back lending in a big way, but they're not giving you any more to put your money in the bank account. So I think there's a real problem here. There was a banking crisis in the US over the last couple of months. So many people might be aware of it with Silicon Valley Bank and Silvergate and so forth. Now, Silicon Valley Bank was actually doing really great business. It's the main bank for technology in the US, and technology has up until the last 12 months been going gangbusters.
Yeah, it was huge.
Then their deposits had tripled or quadrupled in like 3 years. So I think about $190 billion of deposits coming in, and it was 60 only about 3 or 4 years ago. So
should be really solid, right?
That business was going great. It was going really, really well. The problem is they had not enough to lend to. And so they decided to stick it into mortgages. So they bought about 80 billion of mortgages and some T-bills, about 92 billion they invested in these 10-year or long-term mortgage-backed securities at an average yield of about 1.5%, 1.56%. The problem was that in the latter half of last year, things didn't go so great for the tech sector. There was a crypto crash, there was a tech crash, there was a lot of layoffs, and a lot of these startups couldn't raise money because the venture capitalists pulled back funding, right? As a result, these startups, tech companies, burnt down the cash balances they had at Silicon Valley Bank and needed to withdraw more and more and more money. And that went on deeper and longer than expected, which led to an insolvency crisis with Silicon Valley Bank, because Silicon Valley Bank had to sell those mortgage-backed securities. And the problem was the Federal Reserve had raised interest rates from basically 0 to 5 and a bit percent in one of the fastest, if not the fastest, tightening cycle ever, which caught all the banks off by surprise. As a result, if you can go and get, in the US, you could get a deposit account at call in the money market for about 3%. Why would you want to buy a mortgage that's paying 1.56, right? Now, people were prepared to wait 10 years to get their money back. Yeah, you'll get your money back, but in a crisis, Silicon Valley Bank had to dump all those mortgage-backed securities and T-bills, and it did so at a massive, I think it was a $20-something billion haircut. And that led to basically insolvency or a bank run because everyone was concerned it was running out of assets it could sell that were liquid in order to pay everyone back. Now, you look at the Commonwealth Bank and you look at NAB and you look at all the other Australian banks, with their $1.5 trillion of the mortgages. I mean, their latest results look pretty good. Profits and this, that, the other. It's looking great. But the fact of the matter is that could be in a very similar scenario to Silicon Valley Bank in the fact that business was great for Silicon Valley Bank. It was fantastic for Silicon Valley Bank. But like Silicon Valley Bank, what's Commonwealth Bank got to lend to? The tech industry here is non-existent. It does very little. There's 150 billion of lending to corporates, 639 billion to mortgages. Now, if we go into a recession and things are getting tough and costs have gone up and inflation goes up and house prices continue to soar and so forth, you could have default correlation across the spectrum with Australian households going, I can't afford to pay the mortgage anymore because or my renter, if I'm an investor, my renters can't afford to pay anymore. I can't find anyone anymore to pay these sort of astronomical rents. And all of a sudden you've got a problem on one side where your assets, being your mortgages, aren't being paid off. And you've got another problem on the other side where balances are being drawn down because people have to survive. So they're drawing down their savings in order to live because everything's too expensive, right? Yeah. And the Australian banks are only being propped up because of immigration, because business savings are dropping at these banks. That's one of the Commonwealth Bank. The business deposits are dropping. The business is not doing particularly well. And they're being propped up by consumer deposits, which is being propped up by immigration. So people come into the country, they need a bank account, they've got to open a bank account, one of the big four, they put money into the banks to capitalise them. As a result, for example, Commonwealth Bank, 75% of their mortgages are backed by, of the book is backed by deposits. So that looks quite good. It's significantly better than it was in the global financial crisis where effectively Australian banks were insolvent because they're totally reliant upon overseas funding to stay solvent. But we could very well, even though the banks look good now, we could very well be in a situation where people can't pay their mortgages, costs are too high, businesses continue to not do that great, and then maybe immigration turns around because they're reading all the news reports about a Chinese student coming in and having to pitch a tent in the living room for $300, or go out to Eagle Vale for $130, you can pitch a tent in someone's backyard, right? So maybe some of the students go, maybe I shouldn't come here, right? And then we might have a problem as people draw down their bank accounts. So we could very well end up in a Silicon Valley Bank situation where you go, ostensibly the business looks great, but actually fundamentally you got a lot of default correlation in there, and you got a lot of problems on both sides of the book.
It's a pretty depressing a picture you're painting for us all, but it is, I think, a time, politically where we need some very smart, very pro-business, very fiscally responsible, prudent kind of leadership. But politically, the country is swinging to the left, not to the right. Does that concern you, that we see policymakers that are, we've got a Labor, very supported by Green sort of government situation in every state in Australia and federally. What hope do you think of getting out of this? We don't have any Paul Keatings on the Labor side anymore,
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a crisis, actually. I mean, Albo's chosen to take the path of let's distract you with everything that other than the important things that matter. And I think that, and now he's just gone full Burko on like, let's just flood the country with people and just hope that we can kick the can down the road long enough. But I think it's a real problem. I think it's a problem on both sides. I think the Liberal Party had a crisis, and in terms of leadership, and that's why it got voted out. And I think the Labor Party has a problem, and I don't really see any good people in the political stock in this country at all, to tell you the truth.
Well, we're not getting the talent through, that's for sure. We talk about that quite a lot on this show, but it seems that the populace, people generally, with the exception of the people who watch ADH TV probably, don't seem to understand the economic implications of their voting. They don't seem to, because they're not feeling it immediately. And so what we're doing is we're rewarding short-termism in government and short-term thinking, so that governments are just looking to the next election and making sure everybody's happy, and we kick the can down the road 3 years. Well, that'll get us re-elected. Then we'll kick it down another 3 years. Nobody's doing what, less democratic places like Singapore do and say, well, let's look at our 20-year plan, or China, we'll look at our 50-year plan. And I'm not supporting, undemocratic or authoritarian regimes, but it does beg the question, how, with the current system we've got, do we get long-term thinkers and reward long-term thinking if the public don't value that and don't reward the politicians that do that?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, let's look at it. There's two parts to that. One is, if you look at the populist side of voting in Australia, I mean, the Teals are a classic example of that. I mean, that was a bit of a protest vote against the Liberal Party, where ostensibly, quite a large demographic of the Liberal vote went to the Teals. I mean, that vote, that basically their policy is something climate change and nothing else, right? There's nothing about foreign policy. There's nothing about the economy or technology or anything like that. There's zero, right? It's just basically a protest vote, and I want to feel good about myself, so let's vote Teal for climate change, and there's nothing else, right?
Well, and in Brisbane, Matt, just before you go on, in Brisbane, where we didn't have the Teals, the inner city, three major electorates, like Sydney and Melbourne with the Teals, we have the Greens. Right. So the three federal electorates of Brisbane, the central electorates of Brisbane, huge area, is all Green federally now, which says that the inner city Australian mindset is simply climate change focused. The Greens are a bit scarier than the Teals in that they bring a lot, even more socialist sort of thinking and policy in those other areas you mentioned. This seems to be where we're heading. Is there any hope, do you think, on the political front?
Well, just to finish that side up, before I talk about Singapore a little bit. So, I mean, the problem, the Greens' solution to the housing crisis is to try and cap rents. And while I do appreciate, that's the ultimate outcome they want in terms of, trying to keep the cost of rent down, to cap it will just make things 10 times worse because like anywhere you've seen price controls, you make the problem just astronomically worse. So that won't work. You think about Singapore and forward thinking. I mean, Singapore have invested $1 billion in AI, right? And AI, let me tell you, is a major, the change that's going to happen in the next 12 months thanks to artificial intelligence will be greater, I believe, than the impact of the commercial internet in 1994, 95. In 1994, the geeks had email addresses because 1991 was the year that turned on the universities. By 94, the geeks had email addresses everywhere. And 95 was the year your grandmother had an email address, right? And you think about how big the impact of the internet's been. AI is going to have a much, much bigger impact than that. There's been a massive breakthrough really in the last 6 to 12 months in artificial intelligence, where they've figured out effectively how to train software to do human jobs based on large training data sets. And the larger the training data set, the more intelligent and the better that this AI gets. There's currently a thing out from Goldman saying that 300 million people in white-collar jobs around the world are going to lose them thanks to AI in the next couple of years. And 25% of jobs in Australia are potentially impacted as a result of AI. The reason why is anyone who's played with Midjourney will know that Midjourney as a software package can illustrate as good as or better than a graphic designer now. You've got ChatGPT, which I'm sure every school kid's getting to do their homework right now, can write copy as good as or better than people writing essays and so forth and other forms of copy. You're about to have software write itself better than software programmers. What's going to happen is the impact of AI on the world is going to have as much of an impact in terms of social displacement as mechanization of agriculture in the 18th and the 19th centuries and the mechanization of manufacturing in the 20th century. Only this time round, it's going to have the impact on the intellectual classes, the white-collar jobs. It's kind of ironic in a way. All the software bros have been telling the truck drivers for the last couple of decades better learn how to code. Now the truck drivers might be telling the software programmers better learn how to drive a truck in a way. But the point is that Singapore's made a massive investment in this to try and be on top of it because, hopefully all technologies do create more jobs than they destroy, but there is always temporary dislocation. When refrigerators came out and you couldn't sell ice anymore, off the back of a truck, there was temporary dislocation, but ultimately more jobs were created. This time around, I'm not sure what's going to happen because the AI is going to continue getting better and better and better, and maybe this time around there's going to be a real struggle, but there'll certainly be this social dislocation. But Singapore's investing $1 billion to try and get on top of it and create high-end jobs that take advantage of this and build companies that can take advantage of this to try and build a solid future. And in Australia, we don't have very many people. We've got 26 million people. In order to maintain the standard of living that we've had in the past, which is rapidly eroding, we're in absolutely reverse gear right now. I saw this morning, 20 to 24-year-olds in Australia, their standard of living has reversed back to 2008. Yet prices haven't reversed back to 2008, right? It's a crisis. So Singapore's getting on top of this by creating high-end jobs, which will lead to high-end startups, businesses, technologies, so forth, whatever, to create a future for themselves, right? We need to be doing things like this, and it's not just in AI, it's manufacturing, it's engineering, and it's engineering outside of civil, which is just building buildings for people. It's, it's in the other forms of engineering. It's chemical engineering to transform, the gas that we produce out of the ground into petrochemicals, whether it's, electrical engineering to, produce the next version of robotics or what have you. But we've got to be doing this, and we've got to be doing it now, and we've got to string the dots between year 10 in school, where kids make their decisions about their HSC, and a career and the future. And I actually think it's one of the fastest ways we can turn this country around is get more people into skilled education in the trades and in degrees, but the right degrees, right?
Well, what are the right degrees? If you're advising parents who've got kids going into university now, what would you tell them?
Well, let me tell you this much. Unfortunately, while you might think from an intellectual or theoretical perspective, all fields of study are equal, and human knowledge, it's great to push the boundaries of human knowledge for the future.
Yeah, no, I don't think that, Matt.
And you can think about that from maybe a philosophical perspective, but from a contribution to the economy perspective, many degrees completely outweigh others in terms of job opportunities and in terms of economic impact to the country, right? I've had people apply for a job here for me who have had antiquities degrees from Cambridge or literature degrees from Oxford. But when your PhD's in Tolkien, right, it doesn't really practically lend itself to the real world. In fact, the people who applied for those sort of jobs actually had applied for very, very, very low wages. Well, if you come out and you're, for example, a computer programmer, at the moment, you can, as a graduate, you can come into a salary of 70, 80, 90, 100K starting salary, right? Well, the literature students struggle to get anything above the minimum wage and maybe end up working in a cafe, right? If you think about it, we've created, unfortunately, a leaderboard situation with the high school system where you've got your ATAR and then you've got a leaderboard of what you can get into from school, right? And at the top of that, we've got medicine and law. Now, I think we will need more in healthcare. We're certainly getting an aging population. The numbers are going to skyrocket in terms of Australia. And there is a crisis in things like aged care and so on. And that was only going to get bigger. Parts of medicine will be replaced by AI, such as your GP. I think most of what a GP does. There was a paper just published recently where ChatGPT was preferred by 79% of people over a traditional doctor because the responses were 4 times longer, 4 times better, and 10 times more empathetic. And in fact, ChatGPT will be very patient to sit down with a 80-year-old and talk to them for 4 hours or 8 hours or forever, right? Well, a GP will probably want to see the next patient, right? And certainly there's applications in forms of medicine where AI will certainly help. But I think, look, medicine's important. There was a point, however, only a couple of years ago where we couldn't get enough residencies for graduates out of the university system in order to graduate properly. But God knows we don't need any more lawyers in the world. And let me tell you, the law profession is going to be wiped out by AI. The deal makers will be fine. The guys at the top end of law will be fine. They'll be wheeling and dealing and so forth. But drafting now, ChatGPT can write you a stock purchase agreement, a cease and desist, an employment agreement, what have you. And effectively, it's free, and it's only going to get better. Minter Ellison.
Well, and it could also run an entire case. You could just load in your data from the case, and it'll go find the best case law and give you the answer and the result that you're most likely to get in a snap under any particular jurisdiction in the world. I mean, it's not looking good for lawyers.
No, it's not. It's not. And in fact, they're trying to get it to argue in court. Of course, the legal profession has created a bit of a guild around itself, and it's all very, even today, you can't pay a barrister directly. You've got to go to a solicitor. So it's all very archaic and very guild-like. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to change rapidly. I mean, Minter Ellison, which is Australia's biggest law firm, was the first to panic with the CEO coming out and saying, our clients are pondering whether it's billable hours is really the best way to recognise the value. I mean, that's rubbish. I mean, like they know the writings on the wall that drafting, which is a very large percentage of what lawyers do, is gone. I certainly would not want to send my kids into studying a legal degree in the world of AI. It's a very rules-based, very much knowledge-based. Read lots of construct arguments, this, that, the other, and the AI is extremely good and can do it better, right? So that is not an area I'd want to send my kids. And then, you know, when I went through high school, I went to a pretty decent private school here in Sydney. You know, I thought, I hadn't even heard the word engineer until Careers Day. And Careers Day, they didn't mention engineering. Someone's dad was there and said, I happen to be a biomechanical engineer.
Gosh.
I thought, what's that? Is it something to do with driving a train, right?
Yeah,
I went back and did Careers Day, and the kids still thought it was something to do with driving a train.
So engineering still worthwhile, and you mentioned computer programming. Of course, the AI will be able to do the computer programming, but we still need people who are going to be able to understand computer programming.
You're exactly right. So what's actually happening is every white-collar job will go up the stack, right? So what I've noticed, for example, with Midjourney and the design AI, and let me tell you, the revolution here was unbelievable. It was only August of last year that Stable Diffusion was released, which is an open source package, which, you know, the big tech companies have been working away at this for a few years and kept it to themselves. And all of a sudden, someone released an open source thing, which means it's free, and you can get the code and you can modify it however you will. And it's absolutely crazy. August of last year, you would download this software package and you'd type in a sentence and it would make a little illustration for you. And you'd stuff around for 3.5 hours or so, and it wasn't particularly good, but it was kind of artistic. Fast forward to today, and my niece can type in a sentence, and it is photorealistic, absolutely incredible quality output, right?
Wow.
So 6 months, it's gone from zero to, you know, completely changing the world of design forever. What I'm seeing, however, is the designers are going up the stack. Now, designers are by very nature creative, and the AI right now is not very creative. The AI can do very, 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 very well anything that's rules-based or requires knowledge, you know, encyclopedic knowledge, or to construct an argument and this, that, the other. But creativity, it's not really there yet. What we are seeing is we're seeing that jobs are going up the stack, and designers now are becoming more like a director or a producer. So what they're learning is, what does a 75mm lens do? What does a 200mm lens do? What does a circular polarizing filter do? What does color gradient do? And they're learning the language of the job, the level up, which is basically being the producer, the cinematographer, the director, and so forth, right? And I think the same is going to happen to every white-collar job. So, for example, programmers might not be there on the code, writing the code. They may be more of a product manager. They'll be like going, okay, I want a website. It's like an Uber for pets. Now put something above the fold. Now do this. Now do that. And they're thinking more strategically, more creatively, and more like, increasingly more like the CEO, right? So I think that's where all jobs are going to go. They're going to go up the stack. But at the lower levels, we probably won't need so many people. We won't need so many lawyers. Accounting, I think, will be almost entirely wiped out, because accounting is very, very rules-based, and the government doesn't want you to be creative with accounting. And in fact, if you are being creative, there's a problem, right? So that's
exactly. So anything that's rules-based, repetitive, easy to replicate, that can all be done by AI. Matt, we are out of time. I've got to thank you so much for your time. I have got to ask you, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't. How are things going with Freelancer? What are your plans for the future to sort of combat? I mean, you were king of the castle there for a while. You've got some competitors coming in like Fiverr now that are posing a little bit of a challenge. What are your plans to sort of take the lead again?
Well, I think we're in a pretty good position, because we actually have the largest workforce in the world that's online. There's about 67 million freelancers now, but we've got the very broad number of skill sets. They range everything from get a $5 or $10 job done right through to today. Our largest job currently running now is a $6 million project in gene editing for the National Institute of Health in America and NASA. We just completed a $1 million augmented reality, virtual reality project for NIST, for first responders going into emergency situations like bombings or earthquakes, where they can put the heads-up display on. It's like Minority Report. The great thing about AI for our workforce in particular, being the broadest and covering, is that any freelancer now, powered by AI, is now super skilled. So if you've got a lot of talent in emerging markets, low-cost market, that's now super skilled. And so skilled labor available online through the cloud is very, very high, very accessible. And for all these companies, for example, in Australia, that are struggling to hire people because they can't pay the wages, there are some skills you don't need all the time. Maybe you don't need a full-time designer if you're a cafe. You can just go to Freelancer now and get a brochure done for $10, $20 as opposed to hiring a full-time designer. So there's a bunch of things you can do now through our workforce, and they're all superpowers.
And that was Matt Barrie speaking to me back in June. And that wraps up the second and final episode of our spring break series of the Other Side interviews. Next Tuesday night, we'll have a brand new interview for you, and it's going to be a good one. I'll be joined by Sal Grover, the founder and CEO of Giggle.com, an entrepreneur who just wanted to start a business and develop an app that was a woman-only space. But she's now found herself unwittingly at the very centre of Australia's battle for the definition of what a woman is. This is an incredible story and a frightening insight into just how far down the rabbit hole our woke bureaucrats and lawyers have already slid. Quite terrifying and eye-opening stuff, so do make sure you join us for that next Tuesday night on The Other Side interviews. And this Friday night on The Other Side Australia, the second of our two spring break best-of shows, recapping the best bits from the early episodes of our weekend weekly news and commentary show, The Other Side Australia. So we'll see you then.